What's up, everybody? Welcome back to 90's Obscurity. Today, I have Andy Frye on. He is the author of all of that, but most importantly, he actually is from Chicago, and so we're going to do a Chicago edition today, and we're going to play a lot of bands that are from the Chicago area. And you know what's funny, Andy, is I was just talking about this weekend with a friend of mine, because he said you should do a Chicago edition and you should play like Smashing Pumpkins and Liz Phair and Veruca Salt and all these bands from Chicago. And then like 2 days later, you emailed me with this idea, and I'm like, that's so funny. We were just talking about that. It's wild. So I guess it was before we get into the bands. So I am curious because, so I'm also an author, and it's funny because my first book actually had some 90s flashbacks in them as well. Decide whether or not she wants to stay in the 90s or she wants to come back to the current day. So I'm curious why you picked a woman as the main character, being that you are a man, right? Because like my books I've written, the leads are always females because I can relate to females, right? So I'm curious, like, did you have to get into that mindset of like think like a woman would think? Like, what made you choose that?
Well, I mean, for that, kind of after the book had been, I'd gone through a couple drafts. I did but the original idea was just, I'm listening to my Spotify playlists one day, probably in the middle of about 6 different playlists in the 90s. And I just had that thought that I always have had before. Wouldn't it be great if I could go back to see this show or go back to the 90s to do this and that? And I guess I thought a little bit more seriously about it. I started taking notes like on my phone as I'm walking down this area in Traverse City, Michigan, where I was vacationing. And one thing I said to myself is like, if I care about this in about 2 weeks, I'm going to see if I could write a book out of it. But why is Darby a woman? Actually, to be honest, probably before I knew what I was doing, I was just writing. And Darby was, like me, kind of a straight white guy who, is roughly my age, late 40s or so. I think I had an epiphany in late 2020. I pitched the novel. I had a lot of agents say, I'm interested in this, and give me the first 50 pages. And then it was, no thank you after that. And I just had this epiphany, again, walking my dog, actually, sometime at like, 11:30, 12 at night. I think in 2020, I had this realization that probably after, 5 years of a certain, erratic person as president of the United States, after Me Too, after George Floyd, that probably the last thing people wanted to read about, and maybe the last thing that publishers and agents would be interested in, was a story about a middle-aged white guy who wanted to go back to the past. I just had that thought one day. I was like, holy geez, whoa. And I thought about the fact that if you read my sports writing now, especially, I mostly write about sports and sports business. I interview a lot of athletes, and half of the athletes I interview are women, maybe even more. I've gotten the great fortune to interview some big names like Shaq and Tom Brady, but also Lindsey Vonn and Billie Jean King and Michaela Schifrin and Megan Rapinoe. And so that job, as a sports writer who does a lot of Q&As, is I'm kind of sort of tasked with telling other people's stories in short form and not taking certain liberties with the kind of being a reporter, but also kind of being a narrator for someone else's stories, even if it's just an 800-word article. So I just kind of put that to work. And then I thought about the fact that a lot of my sports idols and rock and roll idols, like Joan Jett especially, are women. So I don't know. It was more than just changing pronouns, of course, because I had a version of the book written. And I just changed some things, and I don't know, it just kind of felt more right. It felt a little bit more challenging in some ways, but also a little bit more authentic, and also, here and now, that you could have someone who is a record store owner who knows everything about music, as most record store owners do. But it also freed me from getting caught up in that sort of archetypical scene of a bunch of, hipster guys arguing about, Metallica or Megadeth or the Ramones or the Clash, that you've seen a million times before. And I think it created a different perspective and just some more interesting characters that she could interact with.
Okay. So we'll talk more about your book at the end, but I want to kick it off with some of the bands that we talked about. So the first one I want to talk about is Loud Lucy, because you blew my mind. Yeah. And so I listened to the songs and I was like, oh my God, I don't know if this has ever actually happened to me, because I have a crazy memory. Like, I remember everything I listened to growing up, and I started playing that song Ticking, and like something started happening where I went, wait a minute, I think I know this. And then the chorus came and I went, oh my God, not only do I know this, I think I had this album in the 8th grade. And I looked it up and the cover looked really familiar. And the other song that I loved actually on that album was Down Baby. Remember that one?
Yeah.
So it's so crazy. Like, I don't know if you know anything about them, but because they only had that one album, and then what, did they break up?
Yeah, I get, they were, I had gone to see Elastica on Halloween of 1995. And because they were on DGC, which was a Geffen label, either DGC was Geffen rebranded, or I think it was sort of meant to be sort of the alternative imprint, now that alternative was mainstream in the 90s. So Elastica was on that label. And then so was Loud Lucy, and they're from Chicago. I think they were maybe living in LA at the time. But long story short, they opened for Elastica, and I never heard of Loud Lucy. But at first I'm thinking, like, okay, who are these kids on stage? They've got the Leo DiCaprio, what we used to call the curtains haircut, part in the middle, kind of medium length, baggy clothes, and sort of hiply and fashionably staring at the floor while they play their guitars. But I think maybe Chicken was the second or third song they played. I never heard it before. It just kind of rocked, and I thought, well, I'm going to give these guys a second chance. And I think it showed up on MTV at the time, too, because, there wasn't YouTube back then. You couldn't just go look up a video. So I'm pretty sure I saw that on Alternative Nation or 120 Minutes or whatever show was prominent back then. And, yeah, they kind of played that, I guess, that leg of the tour, if not the whole tour, with Elastica, and as far as I know, they disappeared, or maybe they went back to college or something like that, and that's about all I know. So, yeah.
Yeah, I know. It was wild. Like, that usually doesn't happen to me where I don't remember stuff, and you just blew my mind. So thank you for sending that, because because that's the whole point of the show, is really, I started it because, once Spotify and everything came out, I started rediscovering these weird bands from the 90s that I listened to, like Howlin' Maggie and Imperial Dragon, like really obscure stuff, and they still held up, and they were really good. So I was like, I should just start the show and play songs that people forgot about. All right, next band I want to talk about is Veruca Salt, because I actually didn't know that they had that album Ghost Notes that came out in 2015 until I started the show, and I posted a picture of them on Instagram, and it was funny, like tons of people liked it, and you know who liked the photo that I thought was interesting was Nancy Wilson from Heart. So she must be a Veruca Salt fan? I don't know. But my favorite song on that album was Come Clean Dark Thing. I think that's a great song. And I think you
in pop music, I guess we were back I don't know, maybe the tail end of Gangnam Style and the Harlem Shake and all this terrible pop music that was coming out. And obviously in hip hop, Drake was kind of dominating the hip hop world. So I just think that, I don't know, I feel like we're back at a point where, thanks to some artists like Billie Eilish, and then some of the newer indie rock bands like Wet Leg and Mama and Skating Polly, that we're starting to pay attention to the 90s again. And maybe some breadcrumbs along the way was this album Ghost Notes. I think at the time, I didn't hear anything in Chicago about Veruca Salt getting back together. It's just like, oh, they're back together now, here's this album. And it took me a little while to, I guess, absorb it. But I think it's a different side of them. It's a little bit more emotional, maybe a little bit less dramatic in terms of their lyrics, and they're a lot older. They've been through a breakup of the band and a refusing of the band, and they're just
in the 2010s. And so that's something when I'm interviewing these bands that I kind of ask about, because I'm curious about that, and just how that is, just getting back together and playing those songs after so many years, or recording with the band that you haven't recorded with in almost 20 years. I always find that interesting. I think Ghost Notes is a great album.
The first couple songs of the album probably stick out, but I think it's weird. It sounds nothing like the Smashing Pumpkin album, but I think like Siamese Dream, it's the kind of thing where the first couple songs are more kind of just hitch in the face rock, and then if you hang on a little bit longer, you sort of ease into this other stuff that I think is takes a little bit more listening, but there's definitely a payoff there.
All right, let's talk about Stabbing Westward. I love that you sent them to me, because I did not know that they're from Illinois.
And they don't seem very Midwestern, do they?
No. But what's interesting, and I love that you sent them to me, because they're one of the bands I wanted to talk about on the show. And I just, when I was going through Spotify recently, rediscovered that song Shame. And I was like, I think this is my favorite Stabbing Westward song. That one's really, like, it was on the radio for a bit, but it wasn't as popular as their...
Are kind of rocking and concentrating on what they're doing, that this drummer is like messing with you while you're watching the video. And I think that's why the video hung around. It kind of reminds me of, there's some videos and some bands where we remember the OK Go video where they're on the treadmills. Like, I don't think anybody knew anything about OK Go, who are also from Chicago, by the way, until they saw that video and like, wow, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. Who is this band? Stabbing Westward had a way of interacting with the audience, I think, that was just kind of provocative under the radar. I think that's why Shame hung around a little bit after the other radio singles that came out. That's just my opinion.
Got it. Well, and I also did not know this, but they came out with an album this year called Chasing Ghosts. I don't know what's up with ghosts in the title of all these 90s bands' new album. 90s, because, you know, I say this all the time on the show, but it bothers me, I think, when bands come out and they have a darker sound, and then because the times change, they try to, you know, they get happy, or they try to go country, or they go for a different sound, and it's just not authentic. Like, it doesn't sound like them. Do you remember when Chris Cornell released a techno album in 2009?
I guess, fortunately, do not. It strikes similarity to, I don't know, the 8 years of Chinese democracy that I guess for a while Axl Rose was trying, basically he was Guns N' Roses on his own, was trying to make it into a techno album. I do remember, I met one of my favorite non-Chicago rock heroes is Bob Mould. I met him on my 30th birthday. He was here in Chicago. And so this is 2002, and he was in his techno phase. And I'm like, I'm not going to buy his album that's out now. I think I went and bought something on CD that I had on tape forever, like Candy Apple Grey from Husker Du. Had him sign that, kind of asked him about his new music, but I really was not interested. So don't do the techno thing if it's not your thing. Chris Cornell or Bob Mould or Axl or whoever. But yeah, I think Stabbing Westward, definitely that's their stomping ground. So the fact that they could still do it, you know, and do it, I think, properly says that they know what they're doing.
Yeah, I thought it was good. Because a lot of times I listen to newer albums and I'm just not as into it. And I was like, no, this is good. It actually just sounds like they would have written it in the 90s. All right, so let's talk about Hum. I also did not know that they were from the Chicago area, but they were I feel like they were kind of a 90s one-hit wonder. Like, were they bigger in your area because you were in Chicago? Did they have any more songs that were played on the radio or anything?
Well, yeah. So in Q101 here, Stars by Hum played a fair amount. So there was a kind of a small stable of bands from Champaign, Illinois, which is where the University of Illinois is. And I think, you know, college towns and colleges often have their own innovative scene. So there's a band called Sarge. There's, I'm trying to think who else was from. Like a little bit shoegazer, a little bit grunge. It just starts out with that one chord that hits, and I guess the chord kind of hangs out for a good, I don't know, at least a good 15 seconds or so, and then they ratchet it up, and then they sound like Fugazi for a little bit. So I think they caught the attention of everybody in here in Chicago. And, you know, Chicago's not, it wasn't like Seattle where they were trying to sign bands every day. I think after the scene was sort of profiled, but, you know, there were quite a lot of bands here. And I think that there was an interest in what else was going to hit the circuit, what other bands you could see live, especially when you had, you know, bands breaking up and imploding.
It's very heavy distortion. I like it. But I never really heard anything else by them. But you know what's interesting is I looked them up last night, and they also came out with a new album in 2020, so pretty recently, called Inlet, and I listened to it, and it was their first album since the 90s. Wow. So it, you know, kind of in the theme of what we're talking about, I think all these bands are getting back together. But it was also good. It was the same kind of heavy distortion sound that they had in the 90s that I thought was pretty cool. All right, let's talk Pumpkin. So you interviewed Billy Corgan twice, yeah?
Yeah. So the first time it came up, I was I'd written a few things for ESPN. I covered local football back when ESPN Chicago had a prep blog. So I mean, what that meant was going to the South Side and watching Catholic schools play each other. Loved it. You know, it was that ESPN would run. That's kind of where I ended up talking with rock stars about their sports hankerings and the sports fandom and all this stuff. And I think, yeah, I was writing for blogging for a site owned by the Chicago Tribune at the time called Chicago Now. And the community manager sent around an email or just posted something and said, you know, don't email me about this, but you may have heard Billy from Smashing Pumpkins is starting this wrestling league. If you want to try to get an interview with him, here's his publicist. So like within 15 minutes, I'm thinking, I'm the one person here who could say they've written for ESPN. I'm just going to see if it hits a note or if I even get a response. And I think I got an email back from his publicist probably after dinner. And then the next day we're talking about, okay, well, what are we going to talk about here? And don't ask Billy any personal questions, like kind of all the basic stuff that when you get a rock star is a little bit fussy and sometimes hard to deal with and has opinions that, you know, obviously you want to stay on script. And apparently I didn't know this at the time, but I know this now that Billy Corgan's a huge sports fan. Like, I think it was kind of a fun thing for him to be, you know, to be written about on ESPN because it hadn't happened before. And of course, he's a big Bears fan, Cubs fan, all that fun stuff. So yeah, I got to interview him. That was probably in 2012. And then the next summer, Oceania came out back when he got, I think it was maybe, he got Jimmy the drummer back on board. He was working on James Iha, who came back from the fold shortly after that. It's a pretty good album, rock album that's very different from like the sort of techno-y stuff that we heard in Adore. And, it's when I talked to him the second time, he was a bit more, easygoing, and we just kind of talked about rock influences and all kinds of fun stuff. And I got to meet him a couple times in person, actually, because he had the wrestling events here in Chicago. I got to go to those. So yeah, he's an all-around interesting dude, and he gets a lot of kind of flack in the press, just maybe for not being the most warm and friendly rocker. But I mean, he's probably more warm and friendly than Morrissey. So on my end, it went fine, and we got some good pieces out of it.
Oh, that's good. I have a couple memories of Smashing Pumpkins just from growing up that, like, when I think about the 90s and I think about them, and the first was that Today music video where they're painting the ice cream truck. Do you remember that one?
Yes, of course.
I loved that. I mean, that was one of my favorite music videos in the 90s. They just look like they're having so much fun. And I'm big with like things that just ambiance, like bright colors. I think that's why I loved Clueless, because everything was very, it's just very bright and colorful. And I loved that video so much. And then the other memory I have is just when Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness came out, that double disc. I feel like that it was just like a game changer because we didn't really have the double discs back then, right? Like that was a lot of songs to put out. Yeah. And then B, just like Bullet with Butterfly Wings. I remember just hearing that, and it like changed the game for music in the 90s. I thought that, it was just such a fantastic song. And Zero was great too. And then they had do you remember the Rolling Stone shoot where Billy Corgan's wearing the black shirt that says Zero in silver letters and the silver pants?
Yeah, he wore it all the time. It was kind of kind of like a uniform for a while. So I think they took, I want to say with Zero, especially in that video, you mentioned Shame by, Savvy Westward. I feel like they took a bit from that. Like, let's be a little bit provocative and sort of almost confrontational with the audience watching this video. And they have all these weird people dressed up, with loincloths on painted in white paint who are just like climbing on the top of each other like something out of Mad Max. I think visually, Smashing Pumpkins always had a lot of interesting things going on with all their videos. I loved Rocket off the Siamese Dream album because, I grew up in the suburbs. And, I'm 50 now, and a lot of us who were in high school in the 80s, who went to college in about 1990, 91, like the first, so Rocket, that song, that if you watch the video, it's all about these kids who want to get the hell out of their subdivision, the backyard picnic that's boring them to death while their parents are stuffing, junk food down their throats. And I think they did a great job with the visuals of it. If you didn't know what the song was about, each of their videos kind of depicted what they were talking about and really clued you into kind of the whole story of that album. And then they just, like you're saying with Melancholy, they just doubled down and then included a lot more songs and made it a little bit more intense. And it was definitely high art for the time.
It's funny you mentioned Rocket. I had a friend of mine on the show. She's been on a couple of times. She picked Rocket, and then you love that one too. So that must be a big winner. I didn't pick that one to play today just because I was kind of thinking about it last night, and I don't, I like to play kind of more of the obscure songs, right? So I don't play the popular ones. And I don't know why, but in Ava Adore, I always loved because I felt like they were kind of known and they were playing on the radio for a little bit, but not as well known. But I decided to play because I just wanted to briefly talk about that Lost Highway soundtrack. So for anyone who doesn't know, Lost Highway was a film from 97. It was a David Lynch film. It looks like kind of a creepy film. I never watched it. Mm-hmm. But the soundtrack is fantastic. It's like Nine Inch Nails and Bowie. And I was the song by Smashing Pumpkins that was on that album. So I want to actually talk about, I did not know this, that Local H is from Illinois.
Yeah.
I love Local H. Were you a big Local H fan?
Probably when they came out, they weren't really on my radar. I think, it's not complex music, but it's kind of acquired taste. I actually got to meet Scott Lucas, half of Local H, for the first time this summer. I did a launch party for 90 Days in the 90s, my book, back in June. And my friend Katie Augustine, knows him and formed actually a nonprofit. To like the zoo and the Museum of Science and Industry and Bulls games, and it's mostly kids who have like physical disabilities who aren't able to get around a huge museum or Soldier Field on their own. So there's a bunch of rockers involved in that. I got to meet Scott at my launch party. Just kind of, he's like a typical 90s rocker, like was super chill, hung out, drank some beer, and hung out for a while. So I think probably in the last couple of years I've really gotten into their music. I mean, they don't have a huge body of work, but I know that they've been on tour. If you look at their Instagram, they've got this theme going on with like the Dumb and Dumber. Like if you look at the poster of the Dumb and Dumber, the movie, they got done with their marketing or the sort of their iconography right now. The two guys have Ryan and Scott have a sense of humor. They don't really show it much in their music because their music is kind of it's almost a little like sarcastic and sardonic, but without the humor. Like, it's like the older brother who's kind of pissed off that he has to sit at dinner with his dork younger brother. Like they've got that sort of, I don't know, that's like
dynamic.
They're kind of like the snarky big brother of alternative rock from the 90s, for lack of a better way to describe it. But they put together good music, and they're a local favorite here, and they're still doing it,
Yeah, they just played here in Venice, actually. It's called the Venice West. It's like the only venue we have on the West Side in LA, and they just played. And I think my friend was out of town that I usually go with, so I missed it. But I saw them actually right before lockdown. They opened for Soul Asylum. And that was the last show, for like 2 years. So I was glad I got to see them. But is there any other bands that you want to talk about or venues or anything from Chicago? Because I know Liz Phair is from there. I'm not a huge Liz Phair fan. I know people love her. But you would also mention Material Issue, and my friend loves them. And I listened to some of the bands you sent to, like Sarge. I thought was cool. They had like a 90s kind of girl grunge sound. Peg Boy was very like Social Distortion punk vibes. So if you want to talk about any of your favorite Chicago favorites, go for it.
Well, I think it needs to be pointed out the Material Issue. I can't. I'm not that was on MTV. So their single "Valerie Loves Me" dropped in. I want to say probably it surfaced on college radio. I was a college radio DJ for a while in the fall of '90, I think, or maybe even January '91, and we were playing it nonstop. So Material Issue is kind of a weird name for a band. I'm not sure what they got that name from, but they kept putting out an album with 3 albums in a row with a couple of hits. And it got more emotional along the way. So, long before anybody's talking about smashing power pop in Chicago. So, what do I mean when I talk about power pop? There's all kinds of bands, but kind of the archetypical one is Cheap Trick, where they're rock and roll and they're kind of peppy and up. Their singer committed suicide, I want to say probably in about 1996. So we didn't get to hear more from them, but...
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, there's a documentary that came out last winter, actually, when Omicron hit. They had... a documentary that they screened, and then they played a gig after that on a Sunday night. I missed it. Unfortunately, I could not get tickets. I just was late to the beat. But they're definitely worth a listen, and I think if we talk about Pumpkins or Veruca Salt, we got to talk about Material Issue because they were part of that. Prior to that, there's a couple of punk bands like Naked Ray Gun is a big one. One of my characters in 90s and the 90s is a woman named Spacey. She's probably about 23, working in a record store. And she loves Naked Ray Gun. And I'm not sure why I picked that. I think it would just seem like the natural fit from, a kid a young person in their 20s now who loves 90s music is going to be extra deep cut into Naked Ray Gun because, they're kind of doing it before anybody cared about Chicago or anybody talked about those words, alternative music.
Before we wrap the show with one more Chicago band, I want to just say that you can find Andy on Instagram at Sporty Frye. That's Frye. You can find his book at 90daysinthe90s.com. That's 90s. And you can also find it Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, wherever you get your books online. Mm-hmm. And the Instagram for this show is 90s Obscurity, so 90s Obscurity. So I will post all the links to your book when I air the show. I decided to end the show with Smoking Popes, Need You Around, because it's in the Clueless soundtrack. And, I do love me some Clueless.
The Smoking Popes are playing in Chicago, I believe, tonight. I talked to somebody today. Unless I'm completely confused, I think today someone I knew was like, I'm going to go see Smoking Popes tonight. And, so timely pick.
Awesome. Well, that all worked out. Thank you, Andy, for coming on. I appreciate it.